Exegesis is a systematic way of doing biblical interpretation. The term exegesis can signify both a process and the product of that process. It comes originally from the Greek, and as we use it in biblical studies, it represents an interpretation that comes out of a deep engagement with the biblical text. In other words, the interpretation done with exegesis is one that flows naturally out of the biblical passage. The materials in this PowerPoint, the Task of Exegesis, are based in part upon Biblical Exegesis by Carl R. Holliday and John H. Hayes. There are several reasons why the process of exegesis is necessary when interpreting the biblical text. First, nothing in the Bible was intended to address a modern audience. Second, the Bible was composed solely in ancient languages. In the Hebrew Bible, primarily Hebrew and Aramaic. In the New Testament, Greek, Koine Greek. Third, a huge cultural gap separates readers in this course from the original readers of these ancient texts. The people behind the Hebrew Bible came from ancient Israel or its near neighboring countries. Fourth, the historical gap that separates the world of the 21st century from the world behind the biblical texts ranges from 20 centuries to over 3 millennia. Fifth, the biblical texts were composed and edited in several stages, often over a period of centuries. Sixth, even the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible in existence are copies made several centuries after the originals were composed. Finally, the Bible is regarded as sacred scripture by many communities, with a lengthy history of interpretation. In the slide after this one, I attempt to represent something called the exegetical circle. Biblical scholars sometimes use the image of a circle to try to understand the process of exegesis. Theoretically, someone studying a passage from the Hebrew Bible could begin with any of the points on the exegetical circle. That interpreter could begin with translation or textual criticism, then attempt historical criticism, and so forth. Thus, interpreters like us could begin with any type of biblical criticism in theory. By the way, when I use the term criticism, I do so in the sense of analysis, rather than to imply a negative critique of a passage and what it has to say. This, then, is my attempt to depict the exegetical circle. If you are doing an exegetical paper on a particular passage, you would want to draw upon insights from several different types of criticism. As a general rule, for an 8 to 10 page exegesis paper, we would want to use at least 4 different types of biblical methods or criticism. That's the goal for our final paper. However, for our shorter exegesis papers, we will use something less than 4 types of biblical criticism. Though we can theoretically begin anywhere on the exegetical circle, for the sake of the first 2 short exegesis papers, we will start with translation criticism and grammatical criticism. We will also look at historical criticism as a part of our first 2 short paper assignments. Criticisms on the exegetical circle. Let me attempt to explain some of them. Textual criticism asks this question: what were the actual words written by the biblical author? Textual criticism studies the various Hebrew manuscripts and versions in other languages to try to determine the original words, if that is a plausible goal. Sometimes it is not. So alternatively, textual criticism determines the best available text with which to work. Since this course does not use ancient languages as part of its study, we will need to rely on the opinions of other biblical scholars to determine when significant textual variants are in play. For the procedure to follow for textual criticism, see your Hayes and Holliday book, Biblical Exegesis, pages 45 through 47. Grammatical criticism analyzes a text through its language. Grammatical criticism is not only concerned with the particular meaning that words convey, but also how words are arranged in phrases, sentences, and larger units with a coherent meaning. This method helps the interpreter to get inside language of the text and to derive a sense of the author's thought world. It explores the distinctive ways words were used by the ancient author. Please see Biblical Exegesis, Chapter 4. Historical criticism asks, who wrote a given passage? When was it written? In what language? And for whom? What can we know or surmise about the historical and cultural milieu that produced these texts? What did the text mean for the community that produced it, for the community that used it, for the community that declared it sacred? Please see Biblical Exegesis, Chapter 3. Source criticism. In what stages was a given text created? What seem to be its component parts? What are the relative ages of the parts? By what criteria of style, theme, and form do we classify groups of texts? Are there inconsistencies which disappear after classification into groups? Do the resulting divisions have more internal cohesiveness? More on source criticism. The analysis of the features of a literary piece in order to figure out authorship, historical setting, and compositional character. It is especially concerned to determine whether a document is a unity or composite, and if it is a composite, the nature of the sources used and the stages of composition. Due consideration must be given to theological intentions. Source criticism must be used to aid a full interpretation of the biblical text. Source criticism must always be informed by other methods such as tradition criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism. You can find more on source criticism in Michael Coogan's A Brief Introduction to the Old Testament, one of your texts for this course. Form criticism is a means of analyzing the typical features of texts, especially conventional idioms or forms, in order to relate them to the social contexts of ancient Israel. Thus, form criticism is best understood as a literary sociological method. Form criticism relates texts to persistent human conditions or patterns of action and thought that may have had an impact on their shape. Form criticism is interested in questions concerning what is typical among linguistic entities and whatever gave rise to those conventions of expression. Form criticism is attentive to what is typical in the form of expression and to its content. The concept of Sitzimleben, or setting in life, is central in form criticism. See Biblical Exegesis, Chapter 6, and the handout Form Criticism under Content on Blackboard. Literary criticism is concerned with intrinsic characteristics of the text. That's those features that are inherent to the text. An extrinsic criticism would look at features outside of the text. You hear my ringing phone, I'm going to ignore it so I can talk to you. So literary criticism looks at the compositional arrangement and disposition of a text. It looks at features of style, use of images and symbols, artistic and dramatic effects, etc. The Bible is an anthology of literature, and as such, it is appropriate to study the Bible in the same way that one studies other secular kinds of literature. Tradition criticism is also known as tradition history, and it's a method for following a major theme or tradition, such as the Passover, a major theme or tradition as it is employed in the biblical literature from stage to stage until it reached its final form. The method assumes that folk tradition leaves traces of each generation actively implicated in its transmission and preservation. It presupposes that a theme or tradition has a history, that this history can be discerned, and that this reconstructive study will reveal the significance of the material. See your book, Biblical Exegesis, Chapter 7. Rhetorical criticism recognizes that most biblical literature was composed for a purpose. These texts often attempt to persuade the reader of spiritual truths, theological perspectives on history, positions on social or political matters, and courses of action. Biblical literature was also written in many cases for particular situations and for particular audiences. Thus, rhetorical criticism, which studies the art of persuasion, helps the exegete to discover how the text intends to be persuasive. Redaction criticism. Redaction criticism of the Hebrew Bible examines how older documents or traditions were compiled, edited, and re-edited to produce the text's final form. Related to both source criticism and tradition criticism, redaction criticism tends to focus on later stages of composition and editors who intentionally select, combine, and arrange previously existing materials to create a new literary discourse. From the arrangement of material and evident editorial links and commentary, we can tentatively reconstruct the circumstances prompting this redactional work, including the intentions and agendas motivating the redactors. By the way, you may substitute the word editing for redaction, or editor for redactor. That will help you to understand what a redactor does, what redaction is. Please see Biblical Exegesis, Chapter 8. Canonical criticism. Bracketing out the other criticisms in order to focus on a text's context within the canon, the canonical critic asks, what does the passage mean in its position within the canon? Without reconstructing layers of composition, what does the text itself say? What meaning can the text have that is consistent with other passages from the canon? See Biblical Exegesis, Chapter 10. By the way, canon is a term that refers to a collection of writings that a faith community has determined is sacred. So a collection of writings that the faith community has decided over time has some holiness for them. That's a canon. The final step in doing exegesis is integrating exegetical procedures. Now here's something I cannot stress enough. The text itself should suggest the interpretive process and the methods we follow whenever possible. Of course, we bring who we are to the reading of any text, and that is a good thing, but it is crucial to allow the text its own voice. We must, when doing exegesis, confront our presuppositions and our biases, trying to acknowledge them for what they are. Then we can take them into consideration as we interpret the passage. We cannot bracket out our preconceptions as we read the text, but through exegesis we broaden, modify, or deepen our understanding. An exegesis paper does not necessarily report all the data you have discovered in your research. Rather, a good exegesis paper provides a cohesive interpretation of the passage based upon a detailed and careful reading. Exegetical research informs an interpretation. The exegete uses the research to arrange it into pertinent sections with thoughtful arguments in order to suggest the overall meaning of the passage. Though it is wise to follow the integration procedure for the first two short exegesis papers, we will not attempt integration. The purpose of the first two exegesis papers is to learn some initial methods in relation to exegesis. So that's an overview of what exegesis does and what exegesis is. I hope that you will not allow this PowerPoint that's packed with information to intimidate you. I understand that we are beginners in this process. So take what information you can, attempt to apply exegesis in as good a fashion as you're able at this stage in your study, and trust that that will be enough. You're not expected to be PhD level biblical scholars the first time you try this. But it is a fine method, and it will help you to understand Scripture better. Thank you.